Hello Xlice Frogs, welcome back to another complete guide. This time we'll be covering our newest 4-star Anemo character, Sayu. This time around, I'll be simplifying the weapon portion to focus on specific 3-star, 4-star, and 5-star weapons and how I would recommend building around them. Just like Kazuha, there's different options with how to build her that all work effectively. Besides weapons, we'll be going over artifacts, talent breakdowns, constellation breakdowns, her playstyle and elemental skill mechanics, team compositions, and ending with a showcase. Everything will be timestamped for your convenience, so feel free to skip around for what you need. Let's begin. So, here's my Sayu. As a usual baseline investment for new character guides, she's level 80, she's Constellation 0, and she's 166 talents. Constellations I'll be saving for another time. We'll be running a 4 Iridescent Venerer set, focusing on Elemental Mastery and Recharge wherever possible. I'll briefly show you the artifacts, but since we're switching up the testing portion, this is more for the showcase portion at the end. Alright, let's bring down talents real quick, beginning with her passives. Regarding her passive talent, Silencer's Secret, the crystal flies are only not startleable when you're near them. Picking them up startles them and they flee as usual. Sayu does not have to be the active character for this passive to take effect, so you can use taller characters while she's in your party. So, A1 or First Ascension talent is the Swirl activated AoE healing passive that scales off of Elemental Mastery. At 500 Elemental Mastery, this passive heals 900 HP every 2 seconds upon swirling. An Elemental Mastery main stat piece gives 181 Elemental Mastery, which increases the swirl healing by 217 every 2 seconds. A4 or 4th Ascension talent is much less noticeable, but essentially improves her AoE healing by a very small amount, also improves the AoE of its attack, which is a slight reach improvement for potential swirls. Her A1 is a major portion of her kit that synergizes Elemental Mastery with additional healing on top of increased swirl damage. Anemo characters generally rely a lot on swirl-based damage to assist the team, and that damage scales off of the character's level and Elemental Mastery, which is perfect because stacking Elemental Mastery improves her healing capability as well. Now for her skill talents, beginning with her normal attack. When I said begin with her normal attack, I just wanted to give a mini cameo for her charge attack spin, and also her normal attack animation because it's really cute and the claymore is so small. Let's move on to the elemental skill. Now, elemental skill. This is Sayu's rolling skill. This is where all the complexity in her kit comes from, and there will be a dedicated section in this video on this for maximizing its potential. Brief explanation, there's a tap E and a hold E. Tap E rolls a short distance and then she kicks, dealing AoE damage. Hold E continuously rolls until the end duration, character swap, or by tapping E again, dealing a little more AoE damage on the kick. If you do character swap, you will not be doing the kick damage. The kick generates 2 Anemo orbs of energy. The hold E rolling generates 1 Anemo orb at the start, and then about every 3.5 seconds, and still generates 2 on the kick. The total hold E generates 5 Anemo orbs of energy. You can see that her rolling multiplier, the wind wheel damage, is relatively low, so you can view this as a catalyst for swirl-based DPS, less focus on its raw damage. The kick at the end for both the press and the hold is nice additional damage, but nothing to write home about. I'll discuss more on the mechanics shortly. Now, Elemental Burst. This is Sayu's dedicated healing ability. Healing on summon, and depending on the HP threshold, or with C1, it will attack or heal 7 times during the 12-second duration. During this duration, if Daruma attacks, Daruma will also proc a swirl reaction every other attack that also activates A1 passive healing. At level 6, her Elemental Burst can heal up to 129 plus 7 times 111%, which is about 900% of Sayu's attack. The flat HP regen is up to 6,000. With low investment of 1k attack, Sayu's Q has the upper limit of healing 9 plus 6k, which is 15,000 HP every 20 seconds if the uptime is perfect. With the higher investment of natural 2,000 attack, which is only possible with Wolf's Gravestone, Sayu's Q has the upper limit of healing 18,000 plus 6,000 every 20 seconds, which is a 24k HP heal. This is a pretty solid amount, even at lower investment, because this combined with her A1 passive, she'll be outputting pretty consistent heals, whether she's swirling or her Elemental Burst is active. Now, talent leveling priorities might be surprising, but very friendly, because she scales very heavily off of Elemental Mastery from swirl DPS and healing capability. Normal attack and her elemental skill are not actually super necessary to level up. Base damage gain on her elemental skill is a minor percentage increase in comparison to her potential swirl damage from Elemental Mastery. Her burst, however, definitely scales with levels and is a large source of her dedicated healing. So, I'd say it's perfectly fine to leave her 116, contrary to what I did. 166, which is what I'm doing, is also fine for additional damage on the E, but not as necessary. Normal attack, we can leave at 1. Already from these talents, we can see that her focus is a mixture between maximizing Elemental Mastery for her swirl damage and A1 passive healing, and uptime on Q for consistent large AoE healing. This will become more important as we discuss weapon options and artifact stats and choices. Let's move to Constellations. In my opinion, her capability at C0 is fairly solid, but the most limiting aspect is her elemental burst restriction on either attack or healing. It reminds me of Bennett's elemental burst, where his attack buff at C0 is HP restricted at the same 70%. And that brings us to C1, definitely an extremely valuable constellation that is available right away. This makes her Daruma from Elemental Burst not only have the HP restriction removed, but also allows both simultaneous attack and healing characters, which is doubly as effective. Not only will it heal every action, but it can also heal your characters to full now instead of being restricted to just 70% HP. The additional attacks can proc Swirl for more A1 passive healing every other attack, which means 3 additional Swirl-based heals and 7 attacks. C2, a fun little increase to her elemental skill kick damage. The damage increase is on the same column as elemental and physical damage, not a multiplier increase, so you can view this 66% like a stronger Anemo Goblet's worth of damage. C3, plus 3 levels to her burst, which on top of C1 is a strict increase to her healing output. For C4, this is a synergy to her Ascension 1 passive, adding a bit of energy refund every time she swirls. During her full hold E, she can swirl 5 times, including the kick swirl, which is 6 energy refund backed strictly from C4. C5, plus 2 levels to elemental skill, very standard. Finally, C6. So, this synergizes stacking massive elemental mastery to also grant her Daruma massively increased damage and healing. This is an insanely large buff from only stacking elemental mastery. With just 700, which is triple elemental mastery main stat, 181 times 3, with blood tainted greatsword at level 80, which is 171 with no substats. Each proc of Daruma heals an additional 2,100 HP, and this occurs 7 times for over 14,000 HP total per burst. This nearly doubles her healing effectiveness and makes her build path very straightforward. With this all in mind, Constellations 1 and 6 seem to be the strongest, with C1 having great cost-effective value since it's achievable early and doubles her burst effectiveness. Okay, now that we've covered talents and constellations, let's go over my recommendations for how to optimize her kit, beginning with some of her elemental skill mechanics. To start off, let's briefly mention her overworld traversal speed. Currently, our fastest method of travel is either Ayaka Monosprint or bunny hopping. With Sayu's Hold E, however, she rolls about 15 to 20% faster than their sprints. Ayaka here took just about 10.5 seconds, while Sayu was able to cover the same distance in about 8.5. And Ayaka Monosprints are slightly faster than default character sprints. Also, Sayu's rolling phase does not consume stamina, you can continue to sprint afterwards. However, it also does not restore stamina. As you can see here, I intentionally left her stamina below max, and it freezes there. I personally find this very enjoyable just rolling around Teyvat. Okay, now we get into combat mechanics. The main mechanic to note is getting used to hold E and manually canceling, instead of just tapping E, even if you only want to tap E. A very short hold E manual cancel puts E on a 6.5 second cooldown, but grants 1 additional Anemo orb, for a total of 3. Just tap E grants 2 orbs for the kick on a 6-second cooldown. That's a 50% energy increase for a 0.5 seconds of longer cooldown. Holding the E for the entire duration grants a total of 5 Anemo orbs. 3 instances of rolling around, granting 1 orb each, and the final kick granting 2. This puts the E on 11-second cooldown. Timings are typically, you get 1 orb at the very beginning, and then 1 every 3 to 4 seconds around, and then at the end of the duration, you get 2 for the kick. No matter which one you decide to do, Sayu's E has the added benefit of double swirling as well, once during her roll and 1 during her kick. Alright, so that covers skill mechanics. Let's discuss the playstyles around holding E for the entire duration versus quick swapping. So, for quick swapping, it's no different than any usual quick swap composition. Constantly swapping characters and using low cooldown elemental skills, typically under 7.5 second cooldown. Unfortunately, this isn't really unique to her kit, since in this case, less often you'll be rolling around for extended periods of time. For the other playstyle though, that tries to maximize the effectiveness of rolling her hold E, 2 characters come to mind here that are off-field DPS and are rotational and don't require auto attack activation: Xiangling and Kaeya. Beidou unfortunately requires normal or charge attacks to activate, so she's not as rotational as the other 2. Both of these characters have very strong elemental burst multipliers and continuously rotate around the character for aura damage. Xiangling and Kaeya can also combine to form a melt composition with Sayu as the ball carrier. In these compositions, Sayu doubles as a resistance shredder with Viridescent Venerer and a healer with consistent swirl heals. While maintaining this composition, Sayu rolls around for the entire duration of her E while the elemental bursts from Xiangling and Kaeya are active, so even though her E does have resistance to interruption, a shield to protect her would be recommended. And I think that should be it. A really fun character that adds a unique style of combat. I will showcase a composition like this later. So, Instead of doing a weapon test comparison for Sayu, I'd instead dedicate a section on categorical weapons I find suitable, and how I would build around them, since in my opinion there's multiple solid options. This is very similar to the Kazuo guide in the multiple solid options, and I think instead of doing an exhaustive numerical analysis, it's more time effective and sends the same message by condensing information in section chunks. I'll be assuming 4 of Iridescent Banner as a standard Anemo artifact set, and briefly discuss main set op stats to focus on before going more in depth in the artifact section. So, let's begin with the Elemental Mastery Claymores, starting with the 3-star weapon, Blood-Tainted Greatsword. This is the highest Elemental Mastery secondary stat Claymore we have, with the Rain Slasher in second. This grants 171 EM at level 80, with low base attack, and a passive that unfortunately does not benefit swirl damage, only her base multiplier damage. With this EM weapon, I find there to be 2 effective ways to build her. First, triple Elemental Mastery main stat for 700 to 1000 Elemental Mastery pure swirl DPS and Ascension 1 passive healing. Second, with an energy recharge timepiece and Elemental Mastery everything else. This maintains slightly better Elemental Burst uptime with 150 to 160 energy recharge for more healing effectiveness while chopping off 181 Elemental Mastery, so decreased swirl damage and Ascension 1 passive healing. Being a 3-star weapon, Blood Tainted is an incredibly cost-effective option for players looking for a budget build. For the other Elemental Mastery-based Claymore, the 4-star Rain Slasher, I would build this identical to the Blood Tainted Greatsword. 20 Elemental Mastery decrease at level 80 compared to the Blood Tainted, but 135 more base attack for Elemental Burst healing and base damage. Moving on to the energy recharge weapons, beginning with 4-star Favonius Greatsword. Super solid 55.9% recharge and a passive that generates colorless orbs on crit that refund energy for all team members. In my opinion, one of the best value weapons for her, since it's an all-in-one weapon for her recharge needs, team utility support, and her holdie has multiple instances to activate it, and with higher refinement can activate it more than once during the full 10 seconds. Build path can focus on triple Elemental Mastery with crit rate substats for the Favonius passive. Crit rate mask instead of EM mask is also an option if subsets aren't kind, and if you're struggling to maintain a decent threshold of, I would say, 30 crit for Favonius passive. For the Sacrificial Greatsword, largely increased base attack, but half of the energy recharge value. Her elemental skill also only resets on the kick part, not any part of the rolling, mostly for fun builds where you want to roll around all the time. And the Katsuragi Kiri Nagamasa, which is the new Inazuma craftable for the Claymores. The base attack and the recharge are right in the middle between Favonius and Sacrificial. Passive is a user-only Elemental Burst Refunder, which is a flat return that does not scale on recharge. I'd build this the same way with triple Elemental Mastery main staff for swirl DPS, and the weapon itself will carry the burst refunding. Now for the 5-star Skyward Pride, I suppose if you have it lying around and not used on anyone else, Sayu can take it for the strict high base attack and decent recharge stat stick. The passive unfortunately does not really synergize with her kit. I'd use the same build path as the other recharge weapons. For the rest of the attack crit based weapons, the build can vary between sub DPS to swirl DPS. Because swirl cannot crit and does not scale off of attack, these would be jack of all trades builds, with some damage from her skills, some damage from swirling, and some healing. She does everything, but with lower effectiveness. For Blackcliff, Serpent Spine, Prototype, Lithic, and the 5-star, Wolf's Gravestone receives an extra mention because it's a team attack buffing Claymore, and Sayu has the added benefit of her Elemental Burst heal scaling off her attack. There's multiple builds around all of these, each with their pros and cons. So, you can still stick with triple Elemental Mastery. It's still viable, but if you're going to do triple EM, you might as well commit to EM on the weapon too. It doesn't really make sense to break her from that form. Attack EM crit maintains swirl damage and Elemental Burst healing, sacrificing a little bit of personal damage by sacrificing the Anemo Cup. Attack Anemo Crit is a standard Anemo DPS build with no focus on swirls. Elemental Mastery Anemo Crit is an alternative Anemo DPS build, slight increase to the swirl damage by sacrificing the attack. Elemental Mastery Anemo Elemental Mastery is a high substat ceiling Anemo swirl DPS build, which has the possibility of still maintaining attack and crit, as well as 500 plus EM, and still has the Anemo Cup. With all these combinations, each having their own pros and cons, Sayu's build comes down to preference, with pure EM swirl being a personal recommendation of mine due to cost effectiveness. Her elemental skill roll is a perfect swirl enabler, but by itself does not have a high multiplier. Against multiple enemies, swirl build becomes more and more valuable. Now that we've discussed my weapon recommendations, we'll briefly go over artifact sets and main stats, and this info will be slightly overlapped since I mentioned possibilities for each category of weapon. Beginning with 4-piece options. 4-piece Venerer is the obvious Anemo support choice, best for every situation due to the unique 4-piece passive, reducing enemy resistance and increasing swirl damage. For a pure healing-based Sayu, 4 Maiden Beloved is an option. However, in most cases will likely be overkill and not worth sacrificing the resistance reduction from Viridescent Venerer. Maiden and Viridescent do share the same artifact dungeon, so mix and match is an option while trying to complete her 4-piece set. Other alternative is the standard 4-piece Noblesse buffing set, which grants team attack buff on elemental burst usage and would incentivize a bit more recharge to maintain burst uptime. Now for these 4-piece sets, it comes down to what your Sayu will be providing for your team. In most situations, she'll be the Viridescent debuffer with as much elemental mastery as possible. Since farming this dungeon for a full set may be a pain, do not be afraid to use 4-star elemental mastery main stat pieces to work your way up. Now on to 2-piece mixtures. Here's what we have. 2-piece Venerer and Maiden again. Wanderers for the 80 elemental mastery, and Emblem set for the 20% recharge. So 2-piece Viridescent Venerer is less for the anemo damage and more for moral support that you only have 2 pieces left for the full set. The Maidens is for 15% healing bonus. Wanderers is 80 elemental mastery for raw swirl damage and Ascension 1 passive. And then Emblem is for raw 20% recharge. For newer players who do not have access to these yet, do not be afraid to run 4-star, Scholar, Exile, or Instructor sets until reaching AR45. Scholar and Exile grant recharge and Instructor grants elemental mastery. Now let's dive into main stat pieces for the Sands, Goblet, and Mask. For the Sands, if running an energy recharge weapon, use elemental mastery Sands. Otherwise, elemental mastery, energy recharge, or attack percent depending on the build path you decide. If C6, go elemental mastery. For the Goblet, prioritize the elemental mastery, especially again for C6, but a Nemo Cup is fine if you don't have one yet. And then for the Mask, elemental mastery mask is the most universal, crit rate mask for Favonius or focusing on her sub DPS, and then crit damage mask if you're running crit Sayu beams. That should be it for artifacts. Okay, let's jump into team composition discussion. For Sayu, this is a little different since she'll be supporting the DPS in the composition and providing heals and swirls. This is kind of like a mixture between Elemental Mastery Coswell without its buffing capability and Healing Gene in 4-star form. If running a composition with Xiangling and or Kea, including a shield from Zhongli down a Noelle would be recommended. Sayu with Kea introduces some potential with freeze compositions, with Mona, Tartag, Riptide, or even Barbara. The problem here is though, Hydra application may not be persistent enough to maintain full holdie, so the rotations may be a little bit weird. For the last slot here, I would probably add Downer for the shielding and for double cryo resonance buff. There's also no necessity with needing a Hydro applier here. You can run a pure cryo composition just like a pure pyro with Xiangling. This brings discussion over to Xiangling, who can run pure pyro with Bennett with double pyro resonance, and a shielder like Downer or Zhongli again. Zhongli for more resistance reduction and crowd control. Now this is probably one of her strongest compositions given how innately powerful Xiangling is, especially with Constellations. This composition also does not need to use one of the most popular 4-star supports right now, Xingqiu, who's used everywhere, which allows a bit more flexibility for your other Abyss composition. Otherwise, Sayu fits well within any quick swap composition where your party is constantly swapping for elemental burst and skill spam. As a healer, she can be standalone on any composition regardless of synergy as well. Hand her a Favonius Greatsword and she'll have really strong burst uptime. So instead of mentioning teams that she works on, I like to point out synergies that may not work as well. Eula main DPS. Sayu's only synergy here is healing with a minor swirl, and Viridescent Venerer does not reduce the resistance for physical damage because you cannot swirl physical, which is her main source of damage. Melt and Freeze Ganyu kind of suffer a little bit here because Bennett would usually occupy the healing slot and attack buff for Melt Ganyu, and other Anemo supports have better synergy here with Sucrose for Elemental Mastery Transfer, Kazo for the same, Venti for absorbing Pyro on his Q, etc. Freeze Ganyu is also a bit limited, since Ganyu would prefer to have an absorption-based elemental burst like I just mentioned, or grouping crowd control like Venti, Kazuha, or Sucrose. Besides that, Sayu is a solid standalone swirl DPS healing Viridescent Venerer holder that can substitute most compositions that would typically involve Kazuha or Jean. My most recommended team comp for her is definitely one of the rotation comps that involves Xiangling or Kea. Alright, cool. That should wrap up most of the team composition discussion. Let's showcase some comps. As usual, we'll drop on by Abyss 12, and Sayu will be using the blood-tainted 3-star Elemental Mastery weapon as she rolls around the enemies. Cue the music, Mr. Kobe. And with the showcase complete, that about wraps up the core of this guide. With the consistent healing capabilities like Jean, and her scaling with elemental mastery like Kazuha and Sucrose, Sayu is a really flexible character able to fit in many different team comps, whether you like to quick swap or have her be a rolling menace like I showcased. If this guide helped you understand Sayu a little bit better, consider liking the video and subscribing to the YouTube channel for more similar content. It's free and I'd really appreciate it. I also stream nearly every day at twitch.tv/Xlice, so if you happen to watch Twitch, consider dropping a follow. I wish that everyone's still trying to pull Sayu the best of luck, and thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next one. Take care.